What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, I'll be giving you my full review on the Samsung Galaxy A31. I've actually had this phone for more than a month now, and in that time, I've done a lot of comparisons with this phone to the A51 and A71, and also to some other cheaper devices as well, just trying to figure out where this phone fits in the lineup. The budget and mid-range smartphone space is super crowded in 2020. Samsung's A series lineup gets a new release every few weeks, I feel like, and that puts a phone like this in a tough spot when there are plenty of other options out there. But there's honestly still a lot to like about the A31. I think it's a pretty good phone, certainly worthy of an upgrade if you have the A30 or A30s from last year, and I think in particular, if you can opt for the higher spec version of this phone, the 128GB 6GB of RAM model, that's the one you should go with. That's what I have here, and that's where you'll really get the most value. And if you guys are interested in doing some comparison shopping of your own, or maybe want to pick up this phone for yourself, I'll have some links down below to where you can get this phone at its cheapest current prices. Right now, it's selling anywhere between $230 and $260, which is basically the price range I'll use for this video, but definitely check down below so you don't miss out on any good deals. I have a lot of thoughts about this phone, so I won't waste any more time. Let's just go ahead and jump right into it. First off, let's talk about the design, since I think that's the first thing A30 and A30s owners from last year will notice. With this phone, Samsung basically made some minor updates to the housing and setup that now match the higher end A51 and A71 phones that were also released this year. I think this was the right move because it gives the A31 a slightly more premium look, and it's a decent refresh that makes the phone feel updated. With Samsung's A series, no matter which phone you end up going with, you're still dealing with a plastic build. It's this super shiny, glossy material that's made to just mimic glass, with polished chrome plastic accents all around, but that's all fine. The phone, fortunately, doesn't feel cheap at all, and like I said, this is the exact same setup you'd be getting anyway if you went with one of the more expensive A series phones. So there's no compromises here, really. It's a good-looking phone that most people might not even realize costs well under $300. Up front, this is sort of where the refreshed look stops. Rather than going with a more modern Infinity O hole punch selfie camera and slimmer bezels, Samsung just decided to stick with the teardrop notch and larger bottom chin. Now, to be completely honest, it's not a big deal. It doesn't really matter where the selfie camera is, and with the bezels, we're talking about millimeters of a difference. But I just feel like Samsung could have polished the A31 off with a fresh 2020 front panel design rather than once again just sticking with something we've seen for a number of years now. And by the way, if you want a full top bezel to hide the camera, you can actually add that by enabling it in settings. A lot of people wanted to see what that looked like, so here you go. It's not something I like, but it is an option. Size-wise, I think the 6.4-inch form factor for the A31 is pretty much perfect. It's a tall 20:9 aspect ratio, but it still feels comfortable, and the phone can easily be used one-handed. You're getting a nearly 85% screen-to-body ratio, so there's not a whole lot of wasted space, and the sloping sides and thinner edges overall just make the phone feel slim, comfortable, and easy to handle. And speaking of the display, this is probably the single best feature on really any of Samsung's A series phones, but especially the A31. You get a 2400 by 1080 resolution AMOLED panel that packs in around 411 pixels per inch. Anything you're watching really stands out. Colors pop, it's all very vibrant, and there's a ton of detail as well, since you're cramming in a decent amount of pixels. This sort of goes hand in hand with what I said about the size of the phone itself. The display size and resolution, I think, are the perfect balance. It's not so big to where you're sacrificing pixel density on a 1080p panel, and it's not a small, cheap device with an LCD display or even 720p resolution like on the A11. The A31 really offers an excellent viewing experience, and while Samsung didn't make any changes or upgrades over last year to this display, they didn't really need to. When I first experienced Samsung's A series lineup back in 2019, it was the display alone that really made me feel like I was getting a ton of value out of a pretty affordable smartphone. And once again, in 2020, and like I said, especially with the A31, I feel that same way. I'd even go as far as to say that from the average smartphone smartphone user's perspective, the A series screens look about as good as any flagship smartphone from a normal viewing angle. Most average everyday folks would never really be able to tell the difference between this and a $1,000 S20. It sounds kind of extreme, but I think it's true. And underneath the display, Samsung does offer an in-display fingerprint reader on the A31. Now, in my experience, this isn't the best fingerprint reader. It's a bit inconsistent and kind of slow, but I guess I wasn't expecting too much more. Fortunately, you can pair it with Face Unlock, which I found to be really quite good. Having both unlocking options means that one way or another, you'll be able to get into your phone fast enough. But in-display fingerprint readers, especially on these budget and mid-range phones, still have some room for improvement. Another thing I wish Samsung would upgrade on their A series phones is the out loud listening experience. The single bottom speaker is mostly fine, it gets the job done, but when even LG offers dual stereo speakers on their cheapest budget phones like the K51, you know there's room for improvement. Here's a sample of what it sounds like so you can get an idea. I don't know that Samsung has ever really highlighted their speaker setup on even their most expensive flagships, so I'm not sure they even care all that much, but stereo sound should just be a standard nowadays in my opinion. Fortunately, there's still the trusty old headphone jack down below as well, so you still have the freedom to listen to your content however you like, which is great. So now let's go over the specs and performance, since I think this is probably the thing people have been talking about the most. The A31 comes in a couple different variations. The difference you'll see is in the built-in storage and the RAM options. You can get either 64 or 128 gigabytes of built-in storage. Both options offer SD card expansion, so that's great to see, and either 4 or 6 gigabytes of RAM. Like I said earlier, prices are sort of all over the place for this phone depending on where and when you buy it. But let me just say this, I think to get the most bang for your buck, you should consider the configuration with 128 gigabytes of built-in storage and 6 gigabytes of RAM. That's what I have here. That's far and away the best value. In my experience, you can get that configuration still for $250 or less. Now with that, you get the same MediaTek Helio P65 processor inside, but for me, the chipset has performed better than I expected. Here are the Geekbench and Antutu scores, so you can sort of get a numeric value, but in real-world use, this high-end configuration for the A31 has been a really solid setup. Paired with Android 10 and Samsung's fresh One UI 2, the phone feels fairly quick, and it wasn't very often that I experienced a hiccup or lag issue. When the phone gets pushed a little harder with more apps loaded or even with some gaming, the 6 gigabytes of RAM allowed the phone to keep up. And if you guys saw my speed test comparison with the A51, you'll remember that comparatively it was as good as, and even sometimes better than, the base model A51 with its Exynos processor. This is a phone that can handle just about everything you throw at it with minimal issues, even if you want to use it for more graphics heavy stuff. Call of Duty Mobile, PUBG, Real Racing, and Asphalt 9 all played great on this phone. And while there may have been a blip or a frame drop from time to time, I never felt like I was limited by the phone or otherwise hindered by the processor. All in all, I don't think you should be too concerned with performance, even if you do opt for the version with only 4 gigabytes of RAM. While there are phones out there with better specs for a bit more money, I honestly think the MediaTek processor does hold up well, and I have no complaints. The phone just did everything I wanted it to do and more, and I was totally happy. One other thing I want to mention, this phone packs a 5,000 milliamp capacity battery inside, which if you didn't know is actually 20% more than the A51 and even a bit bigger still than the A71. I'm getting more than 8 hours of screen on time with this phone, and paired with the 15-watt fast charger, battery life just has never been an issue. In fact, the battery capacity really is probably one of the other big reasons why I think this phone is such a good value. It's a bit bigger than a lot of other phones in its price range, and with a good balance of internal specs and screen technology, you really get the most out of the battery life in my opinion. It's a phone that lasts a full day and then some, and I think for a lot of people, that's going to be an important aspect in deciding on the A31. Finally, let's talk cameras. And I guess if I have to choose the one aspect of this phone that I'm most disappointed with, with, this is probably it. Now, right off the bat, I actually think the front selfie camera is surprisingly good. It's a 20 megapixel f2.2 lens, and the results were much better than I expected. Samsung still softens out your face quite a bit, almost like a beauty filter, but really everything else does look good. Color is right, and on the skin tones especially, it's pretty accurate in my opinion. There's a ton of detail, which you can see in my face, and even a portrait shot looks pretty good. It misses the mark a little bit with edge detection, but this is miles ahead of what Samsung offered on their A series phones last year. The selfie camera gets the award for most improved. Around back, the A31 packs a quad camera setup, which includes a 48 megapixel f2.0 main lens, 8 megapixel ultra wide, 5 megapixel macro lens, and 5 megapixel depth sensor. There's a lot of hardware to work with, but not a lot of software features to make good use of it. Video recording is limited to 1080p 30 FPS. There's no night mode, there's no slow-mo, there's no video stabilization really in any capacity. So first, let's talk about what the phone does right. I think in good lighting, especially outdoors, the A31 can take a good shot. The colors are on point, it's fairly accurate without going overboard with the saturation, and there's enough detail, at least at first glance, though the closer you look, the more noise and artifacting you tend to see. The better the lighting, the better the shot will be, and actually this may sound weird, but I found that the wide angle lens usually took the best looking picture. It had better dynamic range, a nicer color balance, and all in all, I sometimes just went ahead and just used the ultra wide angle, even when I didn't really need to, just because the result generally turned out better. Unfortunately, in dim lighting, the A31 starts to struggle, and with nighttime shooting, while it may produce a decent shot every once in a while, the lack of night mode is a bummer, and more often than not, you're stuck with a dark, noisy picture that you probably don't want to use. With video, even at 1080p recording, the results look good for the most part, but the sole issue really is with stabilization. Unless you're just not moving at all, you end up with quite the shaky shot that could be greatly improved with probably even just a software update, honestly. On a tripod, this is a phone I'd be comfortable filming with, but if I need to look around, pan, walk, or otherwise move at all, it kind of ruins the whole shot. In general, I think the A31's camera setup is mostly fine. Again, a big improvement over last year, but there are just some things here that should have been done for a 2020 phone, even for $250. So all in all, I think the A31 is a good device, and I suspect it'll be pretty popular this year, just like the A30 and A30s were. The main problem really is just how crowded even Samsung's own A series lineup is, but particularly the budget and mid-range space in general. I will say this though, if you do end up opting for the 6GB of RAM model, like I said a million times already, you pair that with a 5000 mAh battery, which is great, and collectively, I think you're actually getting a better value than the base model A51. It's also going to be miles ahead of the A21s as well. And with that combination of specs and features that the A31 does offer, that's what makes this phone a decent value and something worth considering. So there you go. Those are all of my thoughts on the Samsung Galaxy A31. What do you guys think? Is this a phone that you would consider? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.